The 20th century is reaching its close. If we attempted to determine the phenomena characteristic of this historical era, sport would most certainly occupy a special place. Sporting events have become the most significant festivity of the contemporary world, and the Olympic idea its humanistic gospel. The calendar of leading sporting events has assumed the role of religious calendars and become spiritual mainstay, and the stadium the most important cult place of the contemporary world. The development of capitalism led to utter trivialization of the Olympic mystery. What took place is precisely what Coubertin was confronted with from the very inception of the Olympic Games. Instead of a church, the Olympic Games became a circus. Instead of being honorable guardians of the original spirit of the Olympiad, the gentlemen of the International Olympic Committee became unscrupulous Olympic Games dealers. Coubertin's Olympic idea was sacrificed to the god of money. The Negroes became attractive power in the development of sports show business and an instrument for reaching strategic objectives of New World Order. This was well perceived by legendary champion of Afro-Americans' human rights, Martin Luther King. He dubbed black stars of US sports black gladiators of the 20th century, who were a disgrace for the black race, as their white masters were using them for covering up the miserable position of the black population in the United States and for depoliticizing it. It is better for the Negroes to exterminate one another in arenas than to fight for their rights in the street, is the motto a New York police chief was guided by at the beginning of the 20th century when he spoke in favor of opening boxer halls in the Negro ghettos of New York. Martin Luther King knew that sport was not leading the Negroes to a promised land. Black Africa, in which tens of millions of children die of hunger and sickness, has become the chief reservation from which American and European clubs are recruiting Olympic slaves. Every year, tens of thousands of young Africans vanish in the increasingly deep swamp of world sports, which has become one of the extermination sites for the poor in the world. Not only is sport a form of dehumanization, but also a transparent form of denaturalization of man. It became a death industry, and as such it mirrors the prevailing tendency of the world's development. The ever-widening gap between men's biological potentials and the requests posed by capitalist progress has become the generator of an increasingly monstrous destruction of the body and mind. Athletes become contemporary Frankensteins. Sport is a symbolic indication of the end of the epoch based on the social Darwinian doctrine and the absolutized principle of performance. The principle of competition has become one of dominance, while the principle of progress has become one of destruction. It is not the visionary spirit, but rather one of apocalypse that dominates sports grounds. The audience is like the smell of blood, is the golden rule on which the world sports industry rests and which represents one of the mainstays of Western democracy. Just as in ancient Rome, experiencing its fall and increasingly large portions of blood in the Colosseum were substitute for increasingly small portions of bread, currently increasingly large portions of blood on sports grounds are man's compensation for his increasingly uncertain and bloody life. Stadiums have become modern concentration camps in which the freedom-loving dignity of young people is crushed and hordes of barbarians created. Sport is the most efficient way of drawing man into a more horrid maelstrom of destructive mindlessness, tantamount to self-destructive frenzy of ancient policies which brought about the collapse of the Hellenic world. Sport has evolved from an ideology of emerging and developing capitalist society to an ideology of capitalist society in decline whose accumulated destructive power threatens to crush humankind. The stand that the modern Olympics represent the revival of the ancient Olympic Games occupies a central place in modern Olympic mythology. Pursuant to it, Pierre de Coubertin was granted the title of revivalist. Coubertin's attitude towards Hellenic civilization was identical to that of European colonial invaders towards ancient civilizations. Unlike those who looted material riches, Coubertin looted ancient spiritual heritage, which has its genuine value only in the framework of the civilization it was created in. The very usage of the term Olympic Games represents desecration of ancient culture. Coubertin uses the term not because he was inspired by ancient spiritual heritage, but because it seemed to him of festive character. In a bid to deprive men of the possibility to confront the established world, Coubertin omits from Hellenic culture, the spiritual cradle of Western civilization, everything that inspires men to raise quintessential questions about his human existence, the world, and man's attitude towards it. The Hellenic macrocosm abounds in deities, symbolizing not only the diversity of living forms, but also that of the physical, emotional, spiritual, and intellectual being of man. Coubertin removed from Olympus all gods who question his rigid utilitarian view of the world and his positive man who is an embodiment of that world. What's most important, Coubertin discarded the freedom-loving impulses of Hellenic culture, including not only the Prometheus myth, but also the critical thought which called into question the basic relations and values the world was based on. Freedom-loving argon is true quintessence of Hellenic humanism. One of the most significant tasks of modern Olympism is to pull up the freedom-loving roots of antiquity and to do away with the freedom-loving traditions of mankind and the freedom-loving dignity of man. The commitment to an idealized past as a source of true values is the most significant bond between antiquity and Coubertin's Olympic idea. The Olympic Games are one of the deified threads introducing order into the chaos of events, unraveling in the shade of Kronos' hill, which is a symbol of permanence in the set and perpetual Olympic times in which there is no future. Coubertin himself insists on the preservation of the sacred rhythm of the holding of the Olympics, but the modern Olympic idea is a cult of the existing world, and as such it is devoid of spontaneity and sacredness. At the same time, the Olympic Games are a festival of spring and youth, signifying the regeneration of the vital force of capitalism, and thus sacred rhythm is a symbolic expression of the unbreakable chain of deaths and births. The Olympic Games are a capitalist resurrection. Guided by Kant's positivist philosophy, an idea of a Western committee, which is to transform positivist philosophy into a religion of mankind, Coubertin endeavors to establish a new church with the Olympic clergy, new dogmatic theology, myths and cult. Coubertin himself says the following about it. For me, sport represents a religion with a church, dogmas, a cult, but particularly with religious feeling. Coubertin proclaimed the Olympic idea supreme and the only right religion of the modern era, and himself supreme priest of modern paganism. The seat of the International Olympic Committee becomes a new Vatican. The Olympic calendar assumes the role of the Christian calendar, and the Olympic Games become the chief form expressing perpetuity and boundaries of capitalist times. The spectacular Olympic ceremony becomes a mythological image of a happy world at the moment of its devoutness to the spirit governing the world. Going to stadium becomes a substitute for going to church. Physical exercises and athletic competitions become a substitute for ascetic life and Christian prayers, and a rite devoted to the creation of the cult of the existing world. The Olympic movement did not arise from the development of sport, but under the influence of the spiritual climate dominant in Western Europe in the second half of the 19th century, which is an outcome of several factors. At issue here is primarily the Industrial Revolution, which began in the 18th century and reached its peak at the end of the 19th century. It became a basis for the creation of the myth about unlimited possibilities of the development of science and technology, on which rests the Olympic progress, whose essence is expressed in the well-known maxim, faster, farther, stronger. Then of the advancement of monopolistic capitalism and institutionalization of the new centers of economic and political power, endeavoring to place the entire society in the service of its interests for good. The main brunt fell on democratic institutions, which emerged from political strife between progressive bourgeoisie and workers, and the creation of a new totalitarian mechanism of power became much more important, which would be an exclusive political means in the hands of bourgeoisie. The new elite of the rich aspired to craft a universal and global ideology which would follow the progressive spirit of the new times, and which in itself would be analogous to that of aristocracy in the Middle Ages in the form of Christianity. With the institutionalization of sport at the end of the 19th century, a mechanism was devised which was to become the principal ideological club for the establishment of order in people's heads by destroying their critical and reformatory conscience and fashioning the character of a loyal and usable minion. The original intention of Coubertin's Olympic idea was to use international sport as a means for creating phalanges from bourgeois youth which will secure France's colonial expansion. In order to preserve the myth about Coubertin the peacemaker, the Olympic gentlemen are persistently reiterating the lie that Coubertin revived the Olympic Games, guided by the maxim, "It is important to take part and not to win." It is as late as July the 19th, 1908, that a Pennsylvanian bishop uttered these words in St. Paul's Cathedral in London at a mass devoted to the London Olympic Games. May France's colonial glory be restored, and get rich, were the slogans fanatic nationalist and racist Coubertin chanted as he set off towards the Olympic heights, endeavoring to inspire French bourgeoisie for new colonial encroachments. He insists on the contest between France and England, which, as the leading colonial force, was Coubertin's sacrosanct model. The ultimate goal of the peacetime competition on the sports ground is spiritual integration of the mightiest states of Western Europe for the purpose of a more successful colonial expansion. What made it possible for Coubertin's Olympic idea to become a global spiritual power is its being an ideological plume of imperialism. The interests of European capitalism are the basis of Olympic internationalism. The European colonial expansion is a source from which Coubertin derived the strength for his Olympic mission and on which the success of his revival venture rested. Olympic missionaries were tasked with doing what the Catholic Church, as the leading spiritual power of the West, failed to achieve: to do away with national cultures and carry out spiritual colonization of the world. Coubertin's visit to the grave of Thomas Arnold, an English reformer, in Rugby was symbolical. It was a pilgrimage to the original spirit of the colonial power of Victorian England, whose originator was Arnold himself. The dream of the conquest of the world by the ruling race embodied in European bourgeoisie is the vision which Coubertin would fanatically follow until his death, and whose fulfillment he would entrust to the Nazis. Embracing social Darwinian laws as a sacrosanct basis for the development of society, Coubertin discards pacifism as a core of the establishment of relations among nations and races and declares war for the imminent and welcome fate of mankind. The modern Olympic Games are not conceived as a festivity devoted to peace, but as a sacred truce during which the hostile sides would temporarily lay down arms to demonstrate their unconditional subservience to the bellicose spirit which rules the world. What gives special dimension to Coubertin's doctrine is his grasp of war as the highest test of man's maturity and the purest of forms in which natural selection is realized, being the basis of the improvement of mankind. The bringing up of youth in a pacifist spirit constitutes an obstacle to evolution and progress, and as such it represents the worst of crimes. Coubertin despises men's love of men, but extols men's love of arms, symbolizing the ruling death-dealing power and men's unconditional submission to the power. What is the cross for a Christian? That is the sword for Coubertin. That no exaggeration is at issue is testified to by the following pacifist view of Coubertin's, published in the official Olympic newspaper Revue Olympique in 1913. Contact with arms renders a young boy man. A wonderful tradition established by the Germans, from which every chivalry originates. The ability and readiness to kill a man is, according to Coubertin, the supreme human value. It is in this stand that the essence of Olympic pacifism is expressed. From the shambles of World War I, into which European aristocracy and bourgeoisie pushed workers and farmers, a revolution was born. First in Russia, and then in Germany. Concerned about the survival of capitalism, Coubertin writes the following: Gymnastics and sports clubs have become the best propaganda instrument. Their present-day duty is to place themselves in the service of masses. Now the life of proletarian youth must be focused on the quest for pleasure in sports, which is the cheapest entertainment for working masses, which keeps them under control. The principal task of the Olympic Games held in Antwerp, Paris and Amsterdam is to stabilize the state of affairs in the West and make it possible for the ruling regime to retain power. Even this time, sport proved to be an exclusive means of bourgeoisie for the fulfillment of its strategic interests. The Olympic Games of 1932, held in Los Angeles, were a spectacular smokescreen of Hollywood type, which was to cover up the horrible consequences of the big economic crisis and to preserve the myth of America as a promised land. In Germany, the big economic crisis brought to power fascism, the iron fist of capitalism, whereby the ruling oligarchy attempted to deal with the workers' movement and secure new colonies for Germany. Coubertin does not conceal his enthusiasm for Hitler. He brands Hitler one of the greatest architects of the modern era, as he sees in him the symbol of the totalitarian power of the ruling race, which is capable of conquering the world.
Ich habe deshalb es abgelehnt, jemals vor dieses Volk hinzutreten und billige Versprechungen zu geben. In uns selbst allein liegt die Zukunft des deutschen Volkes. Wenn wir selbst dieses deutsche Volk emporführen durch eigene Arbeit, durch eigenen Fleiß, eigene Entschlossenheit, eigenen Trotz, eigene Beharrlichkeit, dann werden wir wieder emporsteigen. Geht eins aus, Deutschland nicht des Selbst erhielten, sondern selbst den Schaffen mussten.
Coubertin, the internationalist, was an ardent opponent to mixing the white with colored races, as, according to him, this leads to its degeneration. The fight for the purity of the white race remains the chief goal of its every member, Coubertin cautions. Long before the Nazis enacted racial laws in August of 1935, Coubertin called on the members of the white race not to allow their blood to be tainted by that of lower races, including the Jews, whom Coubertin pronounced Asiatic. For Coubertin, the Nazi Olympic Games of 1936 were the crown of his Olympic idea. He was particularly thrilled with the ceremony of carrying the Olympic torch from ancient Olympia to Berlin, which was to demonstrate that Nazi Germany was the direct upholder of Hellenic civilization. The passage of the torch through intervening countries, Greece, Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, Hungary, Austria and Czechoslovakia, was an encouragement for domestic fascists and contributed to the promotion of Nazi Germany and Nazi ideology. The bridge of friendship between nations, which the bearers of the Nazi torch built, was in effect the avenue of death which the German army was soon to take with the intention of crushing the Balkan nations.
verkünde die Spiele von Berlin zur Feier der 11. Olympiade neuer Zeitrechnung als eröffnet.
Coubertin's loyalty to the Nazi regime was so great that the Nazi Olympic leadership, with Hitler's consent, decided to nominate Coubertin for the Nobel Prize for Peace, and that his speech closed the Berlin Olympic Games. Here follows Coubertin's Olympic speech. Keep watch on the sacred flame. The games of the 11th Olympiad will soon be only memories, but memories how potent and how varied. Memories first of beauty. Since the moment just 30 years ago when I called to Paris a conference on arts, letters and sport with the aim of establishing a permanent link between restored Olympism and the works of the mind, intelligent efforts have helped in the realization of the ideal from Stockholm to Los Angeles. And now Berlin has consecrated it forever, with daring innovations crowned with complete success, such as the relaying of the sacred torch from Olympia and also the magnificent festival in the monumental stadium on the first evening of the Games. Both of these projects conceived by my genial and enthusiastic friend Carl Diem. Memories of courage. For courage was necessary in order to face the difficulties which the Führer met from the outset with the fight of his will, Wer wollen bauen, and in order to resist the disloyal and treacherous attacks from various quarters which sought to impede the advancing work of construction. Memories lastly of hope, for under the aegis of the symbolic 5-inch flag there have been forged muscular understandings stronger than death itself. The swaying and the struggles of history will continue, but little by little knowledge will replace dangerous ignorance. Mutual understanding will soften unthinking hatreds. Thus the edifice at which I have laboured for half a century will be strengthened. May the German people and their head be thanked for what they have just accomplished. And you athletes, remember the sun-kindled fire which has come to you from Olympia to lighten and warm our epoch. Guard it jealously in the depths of your being, in order that it may leap up again on the other side of the world for years hence, when you celebrate the 11th Olympiad on the far shores of the great Pacific Ocean. As the bell of peace echoed and Olympic flags were hoisted in Berlin, German and Italian bombers were reducing Spain to rubble. The Spanish Republic, with a tacit consent from the West, was dying in blood and ashes. After the Berlin Olympics, Coubertin said the following: "What, the games are perverse? The Olympic idea was sacrificed to propaganda? That is absolutely untrue. The magnificent success of the Berlin Games was fully in the service of the Olympic idea." That Coubertin's Olympic idea and Nazi ideology were closely linked is testified to by Coubertin's letter to Hitler of March 17, 1937, in which Coubertin expressed his most profound gratitude for the understanding the Nazis showed for his work as an educator. Coubertin had yet another reason for being grateful to Hitler, namely, the aged Coubertin spent almost all of his 500,000 gold French francs he inherited. Hitler approved the payout of 10,000 Reichsmarks to Coubertin. The father of the modern Olympics accepted the money with great pleasure and gratitude. Coubertin proclaimed the Nazis upholders of his work. He informs them that he bequeathed to them his written legacy, amounted to 60,000 pages, and entrusted them with the task of preventing his Olympic idea from being distorted. Coubertin also entrusted the Nazis with the fulfillment of his last wish, to have his heart buried at ancient Olympia. They did not fail him. They built his heart into the monument erected in the Olympic Valley, named Pierre de Coubertin's Valley. The attitude towards Nazi Germany of the gentlemen from the International Olympic Committee was the same as that of their spiritual father Coubertin. His successor at the post of the president of the International Olympic Committee, Belgian Count by Latour, was the most prominent supporter of the Nazi idea to have the Olympic Games transferred to New Germany forever. Even his successor, Siegfried Edström, a Swede, did not conceal his enthusiasm for Nazism. In 1952, US industrialist Avery Brundage was appointed president of the International Olympic Committee. He was a member of Lindbergh's Fascist Party in America, and during his lifetime he remained an unconcealed admirer of Hitler's. Using his influence in America, Brundage saved a member of the IOC, a war criminal, a former SA Obergruppenführer, Karl von Halt, from well-deserved punishment. In 1951, he became chairman of the Western German Olympic Committee and in 1957, member of the Executive Committee of the IOC. Thanks to Brundage, Juan Antonio Samaranch, who used to be one of the most prominent figures of the Spanish fascist movement, became member of the IOC. His 40-year-long fascist career was crowned with the post of the governor of Catalonia, to which he was appointed by Franco in 1973 to conduct retaliatory measures following the murder of Carrero Blanco by the ETA. Samaranch committed unheard of terror. Prisons were full. More than 3,000 people were killed. A special method dubbed garrotte vil was applied for dealing with the leftists. Strangulation with the use of iron necklace and a nail which is driven into the spinal cord. In 1980, Samaranch became the president of the International Olympic Committee. Yet another fascist villain became the benefactor of humankind by putting on Olympic attire. At the Olympic Games, Hitler said the following: "The Olympic flame must never be extinguished," and went down in Olympic history. He was the true winner of the Berlin Games. The entire nation paid its respect to him and offered him support for setting off eastwards. Money was coming from all sides. Armament plants operated at full capacity. The Jews, Slavs and Roma were to face the same fate met by the North American Indians. Hitler did not wait for long. The sign for the movement was given by Olympic herald Neville Chamberlain. The Olympic torch set off towards the east. The Americans took over the Olympic torch from the Nazis. torch arrived in Korea. The torch was carried by Lyndon Johnson. The Olympic torch was taken over by Bill Clinton. The Olympic flame must never be extinguished.